Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's David. I work for a company called Golden Marine. And this afternoon, I'm just going to go through and discuss some of the major faults with some engines. We got some information from Seastart. What are the top breakdowns? The top three are actually to do with overheating, the fuel system, and the electrical system. I'm going to probably just go through the last three you can see. Some of the smaller ones out of the top 10, what they do throughout the year, they actually list all the ones when they go out for a breakdown, what is the major failure. So we've gone through the top three, which is down the bottom. Some of the unavoidable breakdowns are the actual starter motors, relay and switches, gearboxes, couplings, turbos, throttle cables. These are things that really are out of your control. You may have just had the boat serviced, go out for the first trip, and if one of these things fail, you can't really blame the engineer, even though most of your crew blame whoever serviced the boat. But here are the top three failures. I'm just going to go through the electrical one quite quickly because I think we're going to spend more time dealing with the fuel and also the overheating system. The electrical failures, majority of the failures are to do mainly with the batteries and also the connections. One of the worst ones is actually the earth connections, so it's always good to make sure that you've got a good connection. The terminals are nice and clean. If you've got a lot of acid around the battery terminals, it's worth actually cleaning them down, a little bit of water, baking soda, got that to neutralise the acid. And then if you take the terminal off and give the terminals a good clean, and then put them back nice and dry, and then put a bit of Vaseline or petroleum jelly around the top of the terminals. You can see the middle picture with quite a badly corroded battery terminal. And what can actually happen if you actually leave that like that is that the actual terminal will corrode through and can shear like the lower picture, as you can see in the middle. It's also good to the bottom right-hand picture. You can see an end of the connection which is badly corroded. And you normally find that the connection that will normally fail will be the earth cable. The one that's normally on the bell housing or something, because it's not properly secured, you get a lot of vibration. And then you'll find it will just shear, and then obviously you have a bad connection. Testing the batteries, a lot of people actually will keep like a little electrical tester on board the boat. If you put that tester on board the batteries on the positive and the negative, and it only shows 12 volts, that actually shows that you've got a flat battery, because a fully charged battery with a meter should show 12.6 volts. So if you don't actually get 12.6 volts, then you don't actually have a fully charged battery. So that is one thing to actually double check. There are some different testers on the market for testing batteries and load testing. The top left-hand picture, that is what we class as a load tester, and that you connect onto the battery for between 6 and 10 seconds, and that will tell you what kind of loading, if that drops right down onto the red, then the battery, you've probably got a sail down on one of the batteries. A lot of the companies now will have like a snap-on battery tester, which will give you a printout of each battery, and that's quite a good thing to do if you have it serviced. It's worth getting your batteries just checked and tested. But what I want to do is probably get onto the fuel system, because I think this is probably something that everybody's had an issue with over the years. I think most people have. One of the main things is obviously don't run out of fuel. One of the biggest problems is on boats, that people rely on the gauges too much. And what you've got to remember, a gauge is a gauge. It's not an accurate way of reading what's actually in the tank. So be very mindful on that. And if you have a yacht or a smaller boat, then it's always worth actually keeping a little bit of fuel spare on board, like 20 litres in a can. And to be honest, the best fuel to get is probably from the garage. It's about the same price, but it is a higher grade fuel, because red diesel is not the best on the marketplace. One of the other issues is actually keeping the fuel bug out of the fuel. In the old days, they used to say in the winter, keep the tank full as possible. It's a little bit of change on that now, because obviously with a lot of the new fuels and the biofuels, but I would still recommend, if you've got a stainless tank, is to keep it up to the top, to stop the condensation. One of the biggest problems of getting water into the fuel tank, believe it or not, is actually your deck filler. And it's quite often, if you actually take the deck filler up and have a look, you should have an O-ring there with a bit of luck. And quite often that O-ring will start to crack. And if it does, what that will do, that will allow water to track down into your fuel tank. So if you get that, what you need to do is get to the chandlery, get a new O-ring. Sometimes we're off getting a spare one. Again, a bit of petroleum jelly. And then when you put it back down into the thing, if you do have a fuel key, just nip it down, because some people just try and do it with their hand, or sometimes they have a little T-handle. Again, some of the modern day production boats now use the winch handle, which I'm not too sure about that, because I think people just tend to over tighten it, and then when you want to open it, you do struggle. If you're lucky enough on certain boats, mainly older boats, they will have like a drain cock on the bottom of the fuel tank. If you can just drain that up and just see if you've got any water in or anything. The other thing is you should really also have what we class as a pre-fuel filter, and you can see a selection on the screen there now. Now you should have one of these. Every boat should have one of these between the fuel tank and the engine. The reason for this, it will take out a lot of any muck or anything you have in the tank, but also if you've got a little bit of water, if you have the one with the glass bowls, you can see on the right-hand side, at least you've got a visual, you can see inside the filter if you've got any fuel bug, which is quite black and gooey, or if you've got any water, at least then you can drain it off. Because if you have this type of filter, which is also a pre-filter, if you get water in the filter, that is corrosion caused by the water inside the filter, and it's corroded from the inside out. So you've got to be very careful. So having one which has a glass bowl on is well worth it. What you will find is that a pre-fuel filter, they work on microns. The higher the micron, the coarser the filter. But we recommend, as a pre-filter, like a 10 micron filter. A 30 is a little bit too coarse, but if you go for a 10 micron filter, that should take out a lot of the main muck. Because when you get to the engine, you normally find the engine filter is down to 2 microns, so it's a very, very fine filter on the actual engine. So, hopefully between the two, you should be able to, relieve any issues or any problems. There are plenty of different types of fuel filters, pre-filters on the market. Also quite handy on some of the modern ones that you can actually get a fuel, water and fuel sensor that it will set off alarm. Some of the, the newer engines, that comes as a standard package, when you buy the boat. So you will find what will happen is if you get water in the filter, it will set off an alarm. So at least then it's, it catches it before you have a major problem. Because on some of the modern engines now, as they're using what we call unit injectors, working under very high pressure, any water that goes through those, it can cause serious problems, and are very expensive as well. And that's why sometimes you've got to be a little bit careful with some of the fuel additives you use, because what it does, it puts the water into molecules in the fuel. And sometimes when that's being pushed under pressure through these high pressure injections units, it will damage them. And that has something that's been, has been noted in the last few years. So we're just coming on to the overheating one. I think, has everybody been caught on this? It can vary from a bag being caught on the sea inlet. If you've got a boat without drives, you can pick it up on the sail drive. But as soon as you stop the boat, the bag drifts off, and you don't know what the issue is. You can occasionally get an air leak in a strainer if you lose the O-ring in the actual lid. Impeller failure, and also on the older engines, you will also have a belt which drives the actual seawater pump. But a lot of engines now, it's mechanically, it's off the engine gears. Because what can happen is, that's what an impeller should look like. If you get an overheat and allow it to run, that's what it will end up like. Now, the problem with that, you probably carry a spare on board, and the first thing you do is say, okay, I've got a problem here, stop the engine, change the impeller, put it all back together, and then you still got a problem because the water can't get through the engine. Because what actually happens is, if you actually have a look where the seawater pump is, normally where the seawater pump, it then goes up to what we call the heat exchanger, and then it goes up to what the heat exchanger is there. And that is where normally most of those bits of that impeller will be. So you do need to actually take the end cover off the heat exchanger and take all the bits out. And it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, try and make sure you've got all of the bits there. And then hopefully you will find you can get the engine up and running again. But sometimes on an older engine, what you could find is that you drain all the water down, and you then get a bit of an airlock in the system, and then you trouble to get it purged, to get water back through the engine. Sometimes the secret of that is actually switch the Seacock off. If you fill the seawater filter up with water, and then get somebody just put a little bit of revs on the engine, and then start the engine, and as you're starting the engine, open the Seacock, and sometimes that will purge the water through. Sometimes actually on the boat, when you're actually out sailing, you notice you're getting a little bit of white smoke coming out of the back of the boat, due to a slight lack of water flow going through the engine. That could be the impeller, but obviously if you change that, on some of the smaller engines, some of the cause can actually be what we call the exhaust elbow. Because it's iron anyway, it does tend occasionally to corrode up inside, and then that will also restrict the water flow, through the engine. So that's something you need to have a look. It's more common actually on smaller engines, up to about 40 horsepower, 55 horsepower. Some of the older engines, a lot of the newer engines, don't seem to have so much problems. So what I just want to do is just go back, because then if you do have an overheat, what can actually happen is if lack of water going through the engine, you could end up with having an exhaust box looking like that, which is a bit painful. You won't have to worry about the bilge filling up with water, because there's obviously no water going through it. So it can either happen to that, or it can do that to the exhaust pipe. And you don't really want to see that. I'd be quite concerned if I saw that on a boat. But there are some things in the market which can actually help you on this. One is an exhaust alarm, which is the bottom right-hand picture. That maker's actually a Halliard exhaust. And what you actually do, you just drill a hole in the hose and you just fit a sensor. And the secret to that is, like I have actually seen, someone drill a hole in the middle, then they've got a problem fitting a nut because they can't get their fingers down. So then they end up throwing the hose away. So the secret is try and keep it up close as you can to the top of the unit, and then at least then you can actually get the nut on the inside. If you look at the middle picture, that is what we call a water flow sensor, and that can actually go between the Seacock and the impeller pump. And what that will do, if you get a lack of flow of water, again, it will set an alarm off. So there's two different types of alarms out there. I personally think that one of them should be fitted to every single engine, because that will actually go off that alarm a lot quicker before you start doing damage to the engine. If that alarm went off, that wouldn't happen, and that wouldn't happen. At least then it gives you a chance, if you're in a busy ship and something, at least you can bring the throttle back a little bit to idle, get yourself into a safe place, and then obviously investigate to see what the problem is. Because like I say, always carry a spare impeller on board, that's the must. And the ideal thing, if you actually have your boat serviced by a dealer, when they do a service on your boat, just ask them to leave the old impellers on board. At least then you've got a spare, if you don't actually have a spares kit. Just to give you an idea, you've got a heat exchanger on the bottom left, and the end cap, on some of the Volvo ones, it will have like a rubber end cap, which is a couple of Beaulieu clips, so you can actually take that off to trying to get your impeller bits out. Or some will just have like 3 screws at the end with an O-ring, which means you can take it off, empty the bits out, bit of grease around the O-ring, and then put the end cap back on. If you're changing the impeller, now this is obviously a nice small one, so it's quite easy to do, but be careful when you take the impeller out that you don't use, like some people do, 2 levers either side and try and pry it out, because you've got to be very careful, because the side walls are very thin, and you can actually damage where the screws go out actually on the cover plates. So if you've got a pipe, like a little pliers or something along those pliers, that will pull out, and then trying to get them back in. The small ones are quite easy, just do a little rotation and they pop in. If your hand's a little bit weak, and you've got a slightly larger impeller, the tip is actually if you get a cable tie and then put a cable tie around it, that will close all the fins up one way, and then you'll find it easier to tap it into the housing, and then the clip itself will just fall off. But when you actually put that cover plate back on, if you have a smaller one and it has a paper gasket, is to make sure that surface is clean, the back plate is clean, and then you put that gasket on dry. You do not put grease on it, because what you find is if you put grease on that gasket and do it up, it would just spray the gasket and thin the gasket out. And quite often you find there's a great big lip of paper, and sometimes that may leak. So that's just a little tip just to sort of like to keep an eye on. The bottom right-hand pictures just shows you two different types of sea inlet valves. You've got a gate valve, which is the one with the red handle, and the black one is what we call, well, similar to a ball valve. With a ball valve, if the handle's in line with the pipe, it's on. If it's across like that, it's off. So if it's in line with the pipe, you know that you've got the flow of water going through with a bit of luck. And if it's across, then that should be in the off position. And when you're actually on board the boat, it is good to actually regularly check your valves and should operate them really every time you go on board. For a boat to be left safely, the Seacocks should be left off in the off position. So it is worth checking your valves, and as someone said in an earlier presentation, especially the worst one would be like a toilet one, because it's difficult to get to. And then when you do want to switch it off, it doesn't work. So we've gone through some of the overheating systems. Also, when it comes to in the winter, when you want to flush the system through, it's always good to flush the coolant system through with a bit of coolant mix, 50-50 mix. And the easiest way to do it, if you're doing it yourself, if you put the Seacock in the off position, if you open this, the top of the strainer on the seawater filter, if you get someone to start the engine up and just pour in the bucket of 50-50 mix, and once you've emptied the bucket, stop the engine, and then you can just leave that really in there for the whole winter, and then that will stop the engine corroding. But if you're actually cruising somewhere and you have an overheating problem, and you check the thermostat and you check the impeller and the exhaust elbow's okay, it's quite often that the main heat exchanger core has started to foul up and the system needs a bit of a flush through or taken off to be serviced. But there is a little bit of a quick fix if you're stuck somewhere and you're trying to get yourself up and going. And if you can get yourself to like a builder's merchant, it's not the greenest thing out, but it will get you out of trouble. And a bit of brick cleaner with a 50-50 mix, that will actually clear a lot of the calcium out. I mean, there are more, more eco things in the marketplace, but if you are stuck and you need to get your system up and running, that is just to really get you home. We're just going to touch a little bit on winterization and looking after certain things on your boat. And one of the first things I will start off with is fire extinguishers. And it is one of the things that we do actually quite overlook when we're actually doing our winter checks and everything else. Because if you look at this one, you can actually see it's in the green on the gauge. But I'll pass that round to you. If you can pass. It's empty. So again, what I was saying about a gauge is a gauge, and it's not an accurate way of actually seeing what's on anything. So it is good with your fire extinguishers is to take them off on a regular basis. Check the weight is the main thing. You can weigh them. It does tell you on the back, and they should be serviced on a regular, and normally that tells you on the fire extinguisher. So that is one thing to actually think about when you probably go back to your boat and say, well, it's on the green, but I think I might just take it off the bracket and check it. I think you might be quite surprised. And also you might be quite surprised about the date on it as well. When it comes to winterization, there's a couple of things you can do. If you're actually keeping your boat in the water, you can just do yourself a service and that, during the winter, that's fine. You don't really need to flush the engine through or do anything, because unless we have a situation like that, I'm not staying. Winterization, the basic things to do if the boat's out of the water is to do like a basic oil and filter change. If you've had a season that you've only done like 10, 20 hours and you really don't want to spend too much money on the service, it's always wise to check the pre-fuel filter to make sure that one's okay. If you actually find that filter's okay and it's nice and clean, then you don't really need to change the engine fuel filter, and it is a way of checking. Again, impeller is classed as a serviceable item and should be, on the bigger engines now, it should be at least checked and changed if required. On a smaller engine, and something like that, I would recommend changing them anyway on an annual basis, and then just keep the other ones as a backup spare. It's always good to flush the system through. Certain engine manufacturers, the coolant change needs to be done twice, every 2 years. And it's also worth actually looking through your engine manual and just go through the service protocol, because every engine is different. If you're taking your boat out of water, it's also worth just blanking the exhaust. It stops the moisture and dampness getting up into the engine. It can get into and corrode the valves if one of the cylinders will be open. So that's worth doing. But quite often, if you in the water, you can quite easily just put a little space heater, in the boat. Or quite a lot of people now have started using dehumidifiers. And as long as you know your boat's not going to be moved from its original chocks, the best place to put a dehumidifier would actually just stick it on the draining board. And some actually have a drain pipe you can just put into the sink, and the water can just drain naturally out through the boat, so you haven't got to keep going back and checking it. Some of the other things worth doing on the boats, quite a few yachts, if they have showers and motorboats, you will also find they have a shower pump, which is right in the bilge of the boat. And one of the first things that will crack if you're out in the winter and we get a heavy frost will be that tank, because it will be full of fresh water from a shower. And if the boat's left down and it's cold, that tank will crack. So it is quite good just get a 50-50 mix and pour a little bit down the shower, and then also do the same to the toilet as well. Anybody lucky enough to have one of those deck showers on board, chandeliers earn a fortune every spring because they freeze and crack. Now the secret is you can either take it off and stick it in the sink, or what you can do is just get an elastic band and just tie it up, and just put an elastic band around the nozzle. That allows the water to expand and stop it cracking. Because there's nothing worse is when you refill your water tank in the spring, and then you say, where's all that water running from? And then you go on deck and you just realise it's filling up your dinghy. So, and it is quite a cheap thing to do. But to be honest, if you just unscrew it and stick it in the sink, that is the best thing, to be honest. It is recommended to turn off the gas supply and disconnect your bottle. Your gas system should be checked on a regular basis, and we've got another presentation after me, and he'll go through when you should do it, because that is very important. And to be honest, I'm surprised more mariners don't actually ask for a gas certificate when they ask for your insurance, because if your boat goes up, it normally takes a few others with it. It's also quite good to actually keep your bilges all nice and clean, and because then if you do get a water leak, an oil leak, you've got more chance of noticing it, and then you can respond to it. Because the biggest thing, as you know, water can track from anywhere. It may not be for the engine compartment. It could be one of the windows leaking on a cockpit or somewhere. So it's good to keep it clean, and you've got more chance of actually tracking where the issue is. If possible, I hope we have another nice summer this year. I think we just have it early in the year than later, don't we? Some of the things just to just go back and check on. Again, if you have a chance to, if you've got a glass bowl on your filter, you should check that every time you go on the boat. You should really check your levels every time you go on the boat, and then obviously your Seacocks should be off, and then put it on every time you go on the boat. Sometimes on certain older engines, you can get a little bit of belt dust in the bilge, and sometimes that's actually caused by corrosion around the pulleys, mainly on the crank pulley. So the secret is take the belt off. If you can get a wire brush and just clean the rust off the pulley, and if you get a bit of primer on there, you will then find that belt will last a little bit longer. But it is normally because you've got rust on the pulley that rips the belts to bits. When it comes to batteries, it's also worth checking your batteries on a regular basis. A lot of batteries now are maintenance free, so which is good for everybody. And the thing is, they can fail at any time. I mean, you can check them, but it's like a car, isn't it? You use the car on a Saturday and a Monday morning, it won't start. So batteries can fail. The older type, you should really check the deionized water on a regular basis. And the reason that does get used a lot is because people do leave their battery chargers on. You know, at certain times if you're in a marina, it is good to keep your charger on, because if you do have an issue with your boat, your bilge pump will cut in, but at least then it will keep going and the charger will keep your batteries topped up. You know, we do struggle a little bit if you're in an anchorage or on a swing and mooring, you know, because not every time a marina will pick up that there's an issue, you know, if they don't, unless someone notices the water being pumped out all the time. So that's really sort of like the kind of checks, you know, to do. So if anybody does have any questions or anything you'd like to bring up, then feel free. No questions? So.
You mentioned diesel for winter, and that it's to top the tanks are volume high, that's not necessarily.
We still recommend, because a lot of tanks are like stainless steel, so and they will get condensation. So it is, you know, depends what size tank you got, to be honest, and what kind of, you know, if you're on a yacht. There's a lot of things, you know, on forums, but I normally say now it's really go to what, you know, you're comfortable to do. I personally, with my boat, will keep it full of fuel.
The reason I'm asking is that we've done that every year, and then last year when the boat was in Italy, someone nicked all the fuel.
Right.
So I'm more inclined now to leave it out.
Yeah, I mean that's if it's that's tied up to you. You know, maybe if you keep a heater, you know, in the lockers or something, they might just keep some of the, you know, the moisture out, block the vent up. That might help to stop the condensation getting down through the vent if the tank's empty. You know, it's a bit like propellers as well. I mean, quite often in the winter you take your boat out, you know, and people do like your propellers more than you. So, you know, quite often it is worth, if you can, take the propeller off. And, you know, on a bigger boat you can't do it, but on a smaller boat sometimes, if it's on a sail drive, take them off and stick them on board. You know, but on the bigger boat you need professional tools to actually get some props off. But if you've got a sail drive sometimes and you've got a folding prop, people love those. So, you know, I would be very careful, you know, wherever you are, that happens.
What's the pros and cons about doing an oil change winterization versus doing it in
If you've clocked a few hours up on the wind, you know, during the summer, it's good to do it in the, you know, first in the winter, so you don't have all the acid, you know, the bearing's not sat in, you know, the dirty oil and acid. So that's one of the things I would, you know, recommend to do an oil change. At least then if it's sat there for, you know, for the winter, you know, it's sat in clean oil. Yes.
Do you change it manually all the time, or even if you've done sort of 70, 80 hours?
When it comes to anodes, again, that is a minefield, a specialist field. But internal engine anodes, the little pencil ones, what I recommend, I was speaking to somebody earlier on, they should be checked every season and changed if required. You may find you might be in a safe area that, you know, the anodes just don't get eaten away. It's virtually like anodes on the hull. You can be in certain marinas and your anodes can go in 3 months. Or you can be somewhere else and it lasts a whole year. And that's why you will always find, when it comes to anodes, that every manufacturer will say anodes should be checked on a regular basis. They won't put a time on it because, you know, you could be in brackish water, you could be in fresh water. You know, if you're in fresh water, you should be on magnesium anyway. But you know, it's so many different variants. You know, so they just leave themselves out by saying you should just check regularly. Yeah, and to be honest, if anybody's got a folding propeller, there are certain manufacturers out there. If you've got a folding propeller, they have little anodes around the hub, and quite often they can go within about 2 months, you know, 3 months. Previous company I worked for, we did quite a bit of research for this for one of the major sort of like manufacturers, and what we actually found that if you have a brass hub, if you actually get some clear antifouling, like from International, and actually spray the area, you know, spray the hub and the blades with clear antifouling, then that actually gives a better surface protection. So the anode will last for the whole season. And we tried that on a number of boats. You know, we did it about half a dozen boats, and we tried that all for about 3 years. And it was a notable, you know, improvement on that. Because the last thing you want to do is pay like £200 something just to get a boat lifted to change a set of anodes. You know, unless you can send your crew over the side. Anybody else? So.
We've got an old diesel engine and what looks like some diesel coming out from the cooling water, or the exhaust.
That could be, you know, obviously the engine's slightly worn, the valves, you know, the piston rings are a little bit worn. So that's probably getting a bit of diesel film. It could be the injectors might need servicing. And again, one of the other little tips actually, if you do have an older engine that takes a long time to start, but then once it starts, it runs and runs and runs. So the problem is it's low on compression. And what you can actually do, obviously, if you're in that situation, if you can put the engine stop on, that stops the fuel being pumped into the engine. And then if you crank the engine over with the batteries, that will get some warmth in the cylinders. And it's the warmth in the cylinders that allow it to then the fuel to combust. So then the secret is to stop all the fuel being injected in while you're cranking the engine over. And then stop the engine, put the stop back in, and then you will find it will start, and without having too much fuel being dispersed out the back of the boat. So that's quite a tip, especially on an older engine.
I've recently bought a 36-foot boat, and the diesel, I think, has been in there for about 10 years. I've checked the diesel, it's clean, there's no water there, there's no debris there. Is there any detrimental effect on the engine?
Not really, no. I mean, what engine is it?
It's a Yamaha. It's only done 50 hours.
Right. But the boat's just been laid up for about 10 years. I mean, so it doesn't have a large capacity then, so what was it, 50-litre tank?
It's about 200.
200 litres, and it's full, is it?
No. It's only about 68 litres in it.
I mean, if it's been there for 10 years, you might want to just, take that out and change it. But with diesel, it's not the same as petrol. With petrol, you will find it will lose, its oomph. But with diesel, I mean, you should find it to be okay.
Yeah. What I was proposing to do was just run it out and then just
Run it out, or just, if you can still add another 100 and something of fresh diesel to it. Yeah. But a lot of things, well, I will say, if it's anybody who's only got a small tank, like 40, 60, or, where possible, if you can fill it up with, diesel from the garage, it's a higher grade fuel. You will find you probably get a better fuel efficiency with the garage fuel, and it will actually burn a lot cleaner as well. There, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful.